In a quiet suburban neighborhood, a black man, recently moved in, began to settle into his new home. He was excited to start fresh, leaving behind his busy city life for some peace and tranquility. The neighborhood was calm, lined with well-kept lawns, neat houses, and families who had lived there for years. Everyone kept to themselves, and it was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, or at least, they thought they did. One of the neighbors, a white man, was particularly attentive to changes in the neighborhood. He had lived in this neighborhood for over a decade, and he prided himself on knowing every neighbor's face, their routines, and the flow of things. He noticed the new man almost immediately, but something about him made him uneasy. The way he moved, the way he carried himself, everything seemed a bit out of place. Though he had no concrete reason, the man's presence raised some questions in his mind. The new neighbor wasn't like the others. He didn't wave like the other newcomers, nor did he make small talk. He was polite but reserved, and this only fueled the other man's suspicions. Perhaps it was the way he looked, or the fact that he didn't fit the usual pattern of the residents. The uneasy feeling was hard to shake off, but the neighbor tried to ignore it. Yet, every time he saw the man walking down the street, he felt more and more uncomfortable. The new neighbor often kept to himself in his yard, doing odd jobs around the house, sometimes going into his garage and staying inside for hours. The neighbor's eyes would linger, occasionally wondering what the man was up to. There were no real signs of trouble, but in his mind, there was something about the new man that didn't sit well. Maybe he was overthinking things, or perhaps it was just the unfamiliarity of it all. But then one afternoon, the neighbor's discomfort turned to suspicion. He had just returned home from work when he saw the new man walking around the house, inspecting the driveway. It seemed like something wasn't quite right. Was he casing the neighborhood? The neighbor thought. Without thinking much further, he walked inside, picked up his phone, and dialed the number for the police. He described the situation to the dispatcher, explaining that there was a man who appeared to be acting strangely around his house. His voice trembled a bit as he gave the details. He couldn't put his finger on it, but his gut told him something wasn't right. He wanted to be sure. "I think there's something off about him," he explained, his voice wavering. "He just moved in, but I've been seeing him wandering around. I don't know. I don't trust it." The dispatcher, professional and calm, reassured him. "Sir, we'll send someone over to check it out. Stay inside until the officers arrive." With that, the neighbor stood by the window, nervously watching the new man, who was now busy moving something heavy into his house. He felt a mix of fear and guilt. He had no reason to suspect anything, but his intuition kept telling him to be cautious. The police arrived not long after the phone call was made. The neighbor, still feeling uneasy, watched from his window as two officers parked in front of the new neighbor's house. His heart began to race. The weight of his decision to call the police started to sink in. He had acted on a feeling, an instinct that had nothing to do with real proof. Now, he wondered if he had made a mistake. The two officers stepped out of their patrol car, their movements deliberate and confident. They walked up to the door, knocking firmly but politely. The new neighbor, who had been inside fixing something in the garage, heard the knock and stepped outside. His calm demeanor immediately caught the officer's attention. He looked surprised, but not nervous, as he approached them. The officer who had knocked smiled and extended his hand, introducing himself. "Good afternoon, sir. We received a call about a situation here, and we just wanted to check in to make sure everything is all right." The new neighbor blinked, momentarily confused. "A call?" he asked. "About what?" The officer continued, his tone polite but professional. "Yes, someone in the neighborhood was concerned about some unusual behavior. Nothing to worry about. We just need to ask a few questions." At that moment, the new neighbor's calm smile never wavered. He understood that it was just a routine procedure, and there was no reason to get upset. He introduced himself, giving his name and explaining that he had just moved in. As he did so, He also mentioned that he had recently taken up a new role in the city. "I'm actually the new police chief," he said casually, his words carrying a sense of calm authority. The officers froze for a moment. The officer who had spoken stepped back slightly, as if to process the information. He glanced at his partner, then back at the man in front of him, trying to digest what had just been said. The air seemed to shift as the realization hit. They were standing in front of the city's new police chief, the very person they were supposed to be serving. It was a surprising twist, one that left them momentarily speechless. For the new neighbor, the surprise was evident, but quickly masked by a polite chuckle. "I know it might seem strange, but it's part of the job," he said, offering a smile. "I just moved here, and I'm getting settled. No harm done." The officers exchanged glances, their professional composure returning. They immediately understood that there had been a misunderstanding. They hadn't expected the call to lead them to the man who was essentially their boss. "Well," the first officer said, regaining his usual tone, "there's no need for concern then. We just wanted to make sure everything was all right." The second officer nodded in agreement. "Thank you for your time, sir. We'll let your neighbor know that everything is fine." The new neighbor, still calm and collected, nodded in understanding. "I appreciate it," he said. "It's always good to check on things. Thank you." As the officers turned to leave, the neighbor who had called them stood at his window, his eyes wide with disbelief. He watched as the police left, and for a brief moment, he stood there frozen, trying to wrap his mind around what had just happened. The man he had suspected was now revealed to be someone far more important than he could have ever imagined. The white neighbor stood in his living room, staring out the window as the officers drove away. His heart raced, and he felt a strange mix of embarrassment and confusion. The adrenaline from calling the police was still fresh, but now, the reality of what he had just done started to settle in. He couldn't believe it. The man he had called the authorities on was the very same person who had just introduced himself as the new police chief. His mind raced with questions, but there was one that stood out above the rest. How had he misjudged the situation so badly? As the police car turned the corner, disappearing from view, the neighbor's gaze shifted to the house across the street. The new neighbor, the man he had called the police on, was standing outside, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, looking up at the sky. He didn't seem angry or frustrated. Instead, he appeared calm, almost at peace with the entire situation. It was hard to believe that just moments ago, the man had been the focus of a police investigation based on nothing but a feeling that had now led to an embarrassing mistake. The neighbor continued to watch from his window, but this time, his mind wasn't filled with suspicion. Now, all he could think about was how wrong he had been. He had let his own assumptions cloud his judgment, and now he had to face the reality that he had made a serious misstep. He thought about how the new neighbor had handled the situation so gracefully, how calm he had been in the face of a mistake he hadn't even caused. The neighbor felt a pang of guilt. Not only had he wrongly suspected the man, but he had also involved the police in something that turned out to be completely unnecessary. For the first time, the neighbor realized that he had made a decision based solely on the unknown. The new neighbor wasn't some criminal or troublemaker. He was someone just like anyone else, trying to settle into a new home and start a new chapter. But instead of taking the time to learn about him, he had jumped to conclusions. The neighbor felt a deep sense of shame for making such a rash judgment. He knew he couldn't just let it go. He had to apologize. But the thought of approaching the man now made him even more nervous. What would he say? How could he explain himself after such an embarrassing mistake? His mind raced with possibilities, but none of them seemed good enough. He had acted out of fear and suspicion, and now he felt like he had no way to take it back. Yet, despite his anxiety, there was something else, a sense of respect for the new neighbor. The way he had handled the situation so calmly, even though he had been wrongly accused, left the neighbor feeling both humbled and impressed. He realized that the new neighbor was someone with a level of grace and composure that he didn't have in that moment. The more the neighbor thought about it, the more he realized that he owed the man an apology, not just for calling the police, but for doubting him in the first place. He couldn't let this misunderstanding linger any longer. With a deep breath, he made up his mind. He would go over there, knock on the door, and face the consequences of his actions. It wouldn't be easy, but it was the right thing to do. After all, if he had learned anything from the encounter, it was that the truth often wasn't what it seemed at first glance. The next morning, the neighbor found himself standing in front of the new neighbor's house, his hands trembling slightly as he raised them to knock on the door. His heart was beating fast, and every step he took felt heavier than the last. He had spent the entire night thinking about how to make things right, but no matter how many times he rehearsed what he was going to say, nothing seemed good enough. His mind kept replaying the moment when he had called the police, feeling more foolish with each passing second. He stood there for a few moments, staring at the door, wondering if he should turn back. But then he remembered the calm look on the new neighbor's face when the officers had arrived. The man hadn't been angry, nor had he raised his voice in frustration. Instead, he had handled everything with dignity and grace, which only made the neighbor feel worse about the hasty decision he had made. Taking a deep breath, he finally raised his hand and knocked gently on the door. There was a brief pause, and then the door opened. The new neighbor stood there, looking at him with the same calm expression from yesterday. He didn't seem surprised to see him, but there was a slight smile on his face, as though he had been expecting this visit all along. "Good morning." The new neighbor greeted him politely, his voice warm but still professional. "How can I help you?" The neighbor felt his stomach twist with nerves, but he pushed through it. I just wanted to apologize," he began, his voice steady but filled with regret. "I made a mistake yesterday. I called the police on you, and I should have never done that." The new neighbor listened without interrupting, his expression neutral, but there was a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. The neighbor continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I saw you in the neighborhood, and I don't know, I just assumed the worst. I thought you were doing something suspicious, but I didn't take the time to get to know you. I didn't even think about what I was doing before I called the police, and now I realize how wrong I was." The new neighbor nodded slowly, as though he understood exactly where the neighbor was coming from. "I understand," he said calmly. "It's not uncommon for people to be wary of something unfamiliar, but I appreciate that you came over to apologize. That takes courage." The neighbor felt a mix of relief and embarrassment at the same time. He hadn't expected the new neighbor to be so gracious about it. He thought for sure that the man would be upset or even angry, but instead he was showing him kindness. The guilt that had been weighing on the neighbor's shoulders began to lighten, but the sense of shame didn't completely disappear. I didn't want to leave things like that," the neighbor said, his voice quieter now. "You didn't deserve to be treated like that." The new neighbor smiled slightly, his calm demeanor still intact. "Thank you. I appreciate you coming over to say this. It means a lot more than you might think." There was a brief silence between them as the neighbor stood there, unsure of what else to say. The new neighbor then added, "I'm glad we could clear this up. I know it's not always easy to admit when we're wrong, but you've done that, and that's what matters." The neighbor nodded, feeling the sense of closure starting to settle in. It wasn't an easy conversation to have, but it was necessary. And as he turned to walk away, he felt a small but meaningful sense of respect for the man he had once feared and misunderstood. The apology had been the right step, and for the first time, he felt like he could look at his new neighbor without any lingering doubts or guilt. As the neighbor walked away from the door, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The knot in his stomach that had been there since the previous day seemed to loosen with every step. He had faced the situation head-on, owned up to his mistake, and had been met with a response that was much more gracious than he had anticipated. Still, a part of him couldn't quite shake the feeling of embarrassment. How could he have acted on such a flimsy gut instinct? He stopped midway down the driveway, turning to glance back at the new neighbor's house. He was still standing at the door, watching him quietly. The man had been calm and composed throughout the whole interaction, and that made the neighbor realize how much more he had to learn about judgment and assumptions. It had taken so little to assume the worst about someone simply because they were new and unfamiliar. But in reality, that same person had handled everything with such kindness, making the neighbor feel even more foolish for the snap decision he had made. As he walked back to his own house, the thought lingered in his mind. What if he had done that to someone else? What if, instead of this new neighbor, it had been someone else who wasn't as calm or understanding? Would he have caused harm to someone who wasn't as forgiving? The thought weighed heavily on him. When he arrived back at his front door, he stood there for a moment, trying to shake off the unease. But as he stepped inside and closed the door behind him, something shifted. He realized that he could use this experience as a lesson that, while it had been uncomfortable, had the potential to teach him something valuable about himself. The way he had treated his new neighbor wasn't something to be proud of, but the way the man had responded was something to be admired. The neighbor thought about how his actions had been driven by assumptions, and how those assumptions had been wrong. That evening, as he sat at the kitchen table, the neighbor found himself reflecting on the idea of trust and how easily it could be broken. He had trusted his instincts, but those instincts hadn't served him well. It wasn't enough to assume someone's character based on their appearance or background. That kind of thinking only created barriers between people rather than building connections. He knew that if he truly wanted to improve, he would need to work on how he viewed others, without jumping to conclusions, without letting fear dictate his actions. The next day, he found himself thinking about how he could make things right. He realized that the new neighbor had done something extraordinary. Not only had he been patient and calm when confronted, but he had also taken the opportunity to teach him something important. The neighbor understood that the best way to show his gratitude was to make sure he didn't make the same mistake again. He couldn't change what had happened, but he could certainly control how he acted in the future. Determined to move forward, he decided to approach the new neighbor again, this time, not with an apology, but with a gesture of goodwill. Maybe it was something small, like a welcoming note, or perhaps inviting him over for coffee. He wasn't sure yet, but he knew it would be his way of showing that he was learning from his mistakes and that he genuinely wanted to build a respectful relationship with the new neighbor. A few days later, the neighbor found himself standing at the front door again. But this time, it wasn't out of embarrassment or guilt. It was with a feeling of hope that maybe he could right his wrongs and make amends. The gesture he had been thinking about for the past few days seemed like the right thing to do. He had spent enough time reflecting on how quickly he had judged someone without understanding the full story. He wanted to show the new neighbor that he had learned from his mistake and was genuinely trying to build a positive connection. As he reached for the doorbell, his hand hesitated for just a moment. He had no idea what the new neighbor's response would be. Would he think it was a nice gesture, or would he find it strange and unnecessary? But then he remembered how patient and kind the man had been when he apologized. The neighbor had already shown that he was a person who valued understanding, and that gave the neighbor the confidence to follow through. He pressed the doorbell, and soon enough, the door opened. There stood the new neighbor once again, his calm demeanor unchanged from their last interaction. He looked at the neighbor with a raised eyebrow, as if he was already curious about why he was back. The neighbor smiled nervously, holding out a small card. "Hi again," he said, his voice steady but filled with a sense of sincerity. "I wanted to give you this. It's just a small gesture to show I'm sorry for the way I acted before, and to let you know I'm genuinely interested in getting to know you better." The new neighbor took the card and looked at it for a moment. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a thoughtful one. Something that said, "I've learned, and I care." The card had a simple message on it. "Welcome to the neighborhood. I'd love to get to know you better." Neighbor's name. It was small and humble, but it spoke volumes about how much the neighbor was trying to change his ways. The new neighbor's face softened as he read the card. There was no sign of judgment or hesitation. Instead, he looked at the neighbor with a quiet appreciation. "Thank you," he said warmly. "I really appreciate this. It means a lot more than you might think." The neighbor felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The conversation didn't have to be long, but it felt like a turning point, a fresh start. "I realize now that I judged you too quickly, and I didn't give you a fair chance," the neighbor continued, feeling a sense of relief with every word. "I want to be a better neighbor to you, and I hope you'll give me that opportunity." The new neighbor nodded, his expression understanding. "It's all right. We all make mistakes. What matters is that you took the time to apologize, and that means a lot." The neighbor smiled, a sense of peace settling over him. He realized that sometimes it took a small act of kindness to heal the misunderstandings that had been built. He hadn't expected the new neighbor to be so forgiving, but he was grateful for it. It wasn't just about the card. It was about the effort to show that he cared and wanted to make things right. Before leaving, the neighbor added, "If you ever need anything, or if you'd like to grab coffee sometime, just let me know. I'd like to get to know you better." The new neighbor smiled again. "That sounds great. I look forward to it." As the neighbor walked back to his house, he felt lighter than he had in days. It wasn't a grand resolution, but it was a step in the right direction. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he had taken responsibility for it. And that had been the hardest but most important part. Moving forward, he would keep an open mind and let understanding guide his actions. And perhaps over time, he and the new neighbor could become friends, starting from this small but meaningful moment. A few weeks had passed since the awkward encounter, and the neighbor found himself thinking more and more about how much things had changed. It was amazing how a simple apology and a genuine desire to do better could begin to shift the dynamic between people. The neighbor's decision to step out of his comfort zone and approach the new neighbor had led to something much more meaningful than he had expected. It wasn't just about the apology anymore. It was about building a real connection and learning to see others with more understanding. He had been making small changes in his approach to the world around him. Every time he caught himself making assumptions, he paused and reminded himself that everyone had their own story, and sometimes appearances could be misleading. He had learned that lesson the hard way, but it was one he would carry with him from that moment on. One morning, as the neighbor was getting his mail, he saw the new neighbor outside, mowing the lawn. There was a calm, almost peaceful rhythm to his movements, and for the first time, the neighbor didn't just see him as the new guy on the block. He saw him as a neighbor, a person, just like himself, trying to make a home in a new place. The neighbor stood for a moment, watching him. The new neighbor seemed completely at ease with his surroundings, something that had taken the neighbor much longer to achieve. It occurred to him that the new neighbor might not have been as concerned about fitting in as he had been. Maybe he was just focused on doing his best and staying true to who he was. The thought made the neighbor feel a sense of respect for him, and it encouraged him to take another step forward in their growing friendship. He gathered his courage and walked over to where the new neighbor was working. He smiled and waved, and the new neighbor looked up and smiled back. It was as if the tension from their first meeting had melted away over time, replaced by an easy kind of familiarity. "Morning," the neighbor greeted him warmly. "How's everything going?" The new neighbor stopped for a moment, wiping his brow. "Good, good. Just getting this lawn taken care of. You know how it is." They shared a laugh, and the neighbor found himself feeling more at ease than he had during any of their previous encounters. It wasn't forced or awkward. It just felt natural, as if they were two people who had found common ground, despite their different experiences. "I was thinking," the neighbor continued, "we never did get around to grabbing that coffee. What do you say we change that today? I'd really like to get to know you better." The new neighbor raised an eyebrow, clearly pleased by the invitation. "That sounds great. I'd love to." As they made plans to meet at the local cafe later in the afternoon, the neighbor felt a surge of happiness. It wasn't about making up for the past anymore. It was about moving forward and taking the time to build something positive from where they were. He realized that friendships didn't always start the way you expected. Sometimes, they began with a small act of kindness, a simple conversation, or even a mistake that led to an opportunity for growth. That afternoon, they sat down together at the cafe, sipping their drinks and talking about everything from work to hobbies to what it had been like growing up in different places. The conversation flowed effortlessly, and for the first time in a long while, the neighbor felt truly connected to someone in a way that went beyond just being neighbors. It wasn't about race or background or anything else that might have kept them apart. It was about shared experiences, mutual respect, and a desire to be open to each other's perspectives. As they said their goodbyes later that day, the neighbor felt lighter than he had in a long time. He realized that what had started as a simple apology had blossomed into something much more meaningful. They weren't just two people who had cleared up a misunderstanding. They were two people who were learning from each other, growing together, and building a friendship from the ground up. In that moment, the neighbor knew that he had learned an important lesson, one that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He had learned that it was never too late to make things right, and that sometimes the most unexpected moments could lead to the greatest transformations. As the weeks turned into months, the neighbor and the new police chief began to spend more time together. Their initial awkwardness faded, replaced by a genuine friendship that neither had expected. It was a slow, steady bond built on respect, understanding, and shared experiences. The neighbor had learned that people weren't always what they seemed at first glance, and sometimes the best way to get to know someone was to let go of assumptions and take the time to truly listen. The new neighbor, for his part, was warm and inviting, always willing to share his thoughts or offer advice when asked. He had a calming presence, and it became clear to the neighbor that the man had faced more challenges than most people might have guessed. His life had been filled with both triumphs and struggles, but through it all, he had remained focused on his goals and stayed true to his values. The neighbor admired this strength, and in turn, he began to open up more about his own life, sharing stories from his past that he had never felt comfortable telling others. The more they talked, the more they realized how much they had in common. They both had come from humble beginnings, working their way through life with determination and a belief in doing what was right. Even though their paths had been different, they had faced similar obstacles, and that understanding created a deeper connection between them. They were both just people trying to find their way in the world, doing their best with what they had. One day, as they sat on the front porch of the new neighbor's house, sipping cold drinks and chatting about their plans for the summer, the neighbor realized just how much he had grown since their first interaction. He had learned to listen more, judge less, and recognize that everyone had their own story to tell. That understanding had changed the way he saw the world and the people around him. He wasn't as quick to make assumptions anymore. Instead, he gave people the space to reveal who they truly were. The new neighbor had also taught him something important. Forgiveness and understanding were essential to building any relationship, whether it was with a neighbor, a friend, or even a stranger. The neighbor had been lucky to receive those gifts in abundance from someone who had every reason to be upset with him. Instead of holding on to resentment, the new neighbor had chosen to embrace the opportunity for growth and connection, and that made all the difference. As they talked about their plans for the future, the neighbor felt grateful for the unexpected friendship that had blossomed from a moment of misjudgment. He realized that sometimes life's most valuable lessons came from the most surprising places. It wasn't just about moving past a mistake. It was about taking the time to build something real and meaningful from it. And in doing so, both men had found a bond that would last for years to come. In the months that followed, the neighborhood became a little brighter, a little warmer. More people reached out, inspired by the friendship between the two men. The neighbor's willingness to admit his mistake and take the first step toward understanding had shown others that it was never too late to change, to learn, and to grow. What started as a single, uncomfortable interaction had turned into a ripple effect of kindness, respect, and genuine human connection. Looking back on everything, the neighbor understood one simple truth. People weren't defined by their first impression or the mistakes of others. What truly mattered was how they chose to move forward and how they treated each other along the way. With that in mind, he knew that he would never again let fear or assumptions guide his actions. Instead, he would approach life with an open heart, ready to learn from the people around him, just as he had done with his new friend.